And now to discuss the problem of Islamophobia, particularly in France and across Europe, I'm joined live from Birmingham by Professor Francis Davies, who's the Professor of Religion and Public Policy at the University of Birmingham. Professor Davies, thank you very much for joining me today here on A News. Now, as we've just been seeing in our previous reports, lots of problems in France at the moment, but one of the problems which we're also very much concerned about is that of Islamophobia, but particularly in France, but also across Europe. Why is the issue of Islamophobia rising in Europe, and can you give us some examples of it?
Well, I think in many European countries there's an increase in the number of attacks on women who are visibly Muslim, whether they're a lawyer or whether they're a poor woman, whether they cause a threat or not. And that's a grave concern. And I think in the French case there's some very strange actions going on. So the government's going to crack down on 80 mosques and is insisting that mosques in general should declare an allegiance to France through a charter on French values. But if you gave me a week, I could take you to more than 80 Catholic churches in France where the Catholicism is so intensely conservative that it could be said to subvert French values by its attitude to the Jewish community, by its attitude to LGBT communities, and even by an enduring conviction that the Catholic Church should be completely intertwined with the French state. So I think there's a problem in Europe as a whole, which is about the classic social tensions of there being minorities. But I think there's a French problem, which is that laïcité has now been running for so long that it's disempowered the French state from any ability to be able to have cultural nuance, religious sensibility, a rich understanding of the diversity of the kinds of communities it's created. And that's creating very particularly French problems, which in turn will undermine the European project in due course.
So why particularly do you think that the Muslims are being targeted? Why is Macron focusing on Islam as what he called a religion in crisis? Why is he doing this?
Well, I mean, in England in the 19th century, there used to be parliamentarians who would stand up and condemn women with strange headdresses for bringing foreign religion to the British country. And what they were talking about was Irish nuns arriving to set up schools in the city of Birmingham, where I am. Okay, and it just seems to me that there's been a habit in many European countries of picking out a visible minority at a time of economic crisis, at a time of social risk, and especially a couple of years out from a presidential or prime ministerial election, and saying, let's blame them, let's target them. And of course, what Monsieur Macron's not being completely honest about, nor his interior minister, is this is a time when France is trying to shape Northern Africa, when France's role in the Minsk group and Nagorno-Karabakh is under pressure, when France has got planes over Syria and other areas, and there's a difference of emphasis there. So it seems to me there's an interlocking of foreign policy and domestic policy to kind of point towards some sort of notional enemy within, and to distract from all sorts of other decisions that are being made that are a terrible risk to France internationally as well as domestically.
And I quite agree that it's a tremendous risk. And what seems very strange to me is that France, of all countries, should have learned the lessons of the 1930s, where in Germany, the one religious group, the Jewish minority, were being targeted. And we saw what happened as a result of that in the Second World War with the Holocaust. It seems astonishing to me that France should be willing to play this game now.
Yeah, I mean, I think since 1870, France has not been permitted to learn anything about its religious communities and its census formally. And now that attempt to force religious discourse, religious imagery, religious communities out of the public sphere is being accelerated by the Interior Ministry's strategies. And it just seems to me that what that does is it leaves a public void where people have to walk around in the public square pretending to be something that they're not. And it means that the public policies that are then invented have no nuance. Because we already know from South Africa, from Northern Ireland, even from Peru, that when a government decides in this way to try and change the way that people thinks, to attack a minority in this way, it drives the moderate majority into the hands of the radicals it doesn't even reduce the amount of radicalism that may or may not be found in a society. So it seems to me that France, by not learning, by squeezing this learning out and yet at the same time trying to act, is going to make things worse, because it's not reached out to learn from what's best in good public policy. And even, just a quick thought, from its own failures in places like Rwanda, where it became entirely complicit in genocide simply by misreading the situation and ending up backing the wrong side because it got it so wrong.
So you see this more as targeting a minority which happens to be Islamic, but boosting up the perception that it's Islam itself that is hitting.
Yeah. So so I mean, in the days of Marshal Pétain, it was the Jewish community. This time round, the visible minority is the Muslim community, and it's made worse by the fact that in Islam, race and ethnicity, France's colonial history in North Africa and the Maghreb, and domestic politics all collide into one at a time that it's trying to take several international actions at the same time. And then if you put into the middle of that this religious literacy, this lack of cultural nuance, basically you're creating a uniquely French powder keg, not only in the middle of French society, but in the middle of the European project,
yes.
And actually with wider implications for the safety of citizens in Islamic communities right across North Africa and into the French diaspora. And
one of the great ironies, of course, is that the vast majority of the Muslims, I'm sure, in France are actually French-born and bred. So it's hitting itself in a very real sense.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, because these are people that generate wealth for the country, and I spend a lot of time in France. I love the place, and if I say to Muslim families, what's the number one Muslim problem, they say it's earning enough money to look after my family, to get my kids into university, in my dream world to have a doctor or an accountant in the family. That is the number one Muslim problem, and that's the number one French national problem. It's the number one human problem, and a few people on the margins, whether they're at the extreme right of the Catholic Church or whether they're on the extreme radical end of the Muslim community, from within or without, is absolutely not a justification to start registering religious leaders, constraining religious freedom, and trying to let the police off scrutiny just at the moment that the police are going into 80 mosques around the country to take all sorts of actions where scrutiny and cameras ought to be present the whole time. So I think Macron is playing politics with fire. The policy agenda is a policy agenda that's failed in almost every other place. And all this will do is undermine ordinary Muslim lives, ordinary French lives, ordinary European lives, and it'll do it for years to come.
It's a very dangerous way to move forward. I'd like to just change direction a slight bit and ask, we can identify the problems, and we can both agree very strongly that those problems could lead to a very dangerous future. How can this be turned around? I know in Birmingham with the Edward Cadbury Centre, you're looking at how the connections can be made between faith communities, if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and how you see that as maybe a way of moving forward?
Yeah, so we've been part of some government-funded and also some private-funded initiatives, one of them led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the Anglican Church, which seek at the micro level to bring people together to have conversations that they wouldn't normally have. And there are examples of this in Paris. You know, you can bring Muslims and Catholics together to talk about the Virgin Mary, because she's the only woman mentioned in the Quran, as well as being a woman mentioned in the Bible. And then people have something common to talk about. You can have an interreligious football league. You can have an interreligious and interfaith and cross-community sports club and education and learning. And it's by focusing on the common issues that you start to build bridges. And so, for example, in London, we've been involved in tracking some really important work where 200 faith groups, trade unions, citizens groups from all 9 major religious communities in London came together. And we said, what's the biggest challenge that you're all facing? And it was low wages. And what grew out of that was a campaign for a living wage for all the people of London. And the backrock of that campaign for a living wage for the whole of London, which has now been adopted in many places nationally, were mosques, synagogues, churches and trade union groups campaigning together. But if you don't let people talk about what they have in common together, using the religious language and the other languages by which they articulate who they are, where they come from, what's important to them, then you stop that bridge building. And it seems to me that French laïcité, by pushing so hard, what makes people tick into the private sphere is making them frightened to even build bridges using the words that might bring them together. And we found ways around that in Birmingham quite well. And we found ways doing similar things like that in other countries such as Germany. And it now seems to me that that kind of dialogue, that kind of strategy in France is essential. And particularly in France, there's a thing about the banlieue versus the centre of town and the urban arena versus the rural arenas. Because don't scare rural Brittany that the Muslim threat is coming if rural Brittany won't be going to a major city in future times. And all they're picking up is badly presented images. You need to consciously build bridges between the rural and the urban, the rich and the poor, the black and the white, and the diversities of religions. And when you do it, it cracks open potential. And you find that a white working class kid who's never been to the Élysée Palace gets to go and visit the Élysée Palace with a Muslim working class kid that never dreamt of going out of his neighbourhood. And what they've got in common is they've never been to the capital, they've never been to a beach, they've never had a job, they've never seen a dad in work. Yeah. And all these things they have in common. But you have to create the safe spaces to make it happen. And we've been trying that in Birmingham and with the support of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it's definitely a model that can be replicated. And when it's tried, it works. It really works.
It sounds so very simple. It's, again, changing perceptions. The whole Islamophobia or any phobia is based on wrong perceptions. And so what you would suggest is that people should work to change their perceptions and build bridges.
Yeah, and by doing things that aren't about religion, by doing things together that are about a shared problem, say unemployment, about wages, about access to food, but being allowed to talk about the fact that I haven't got wages using Islamic language. So a good example of this is if we want to encourage more generosity in giving, the single most generous community in Britain per capita is the Muslim community. But for the Muslim community to be able to articulate that, they need to be able to talk about Ramadan, the role of zakat, the fact that they do a lot of their giving in concentrated parts of the year. And actually, when you start talking about that, you discover that alongside other fundraising initiatives, you know, here are tactics, here are skills, and here's generosity that everybody in the country wants to celebrate. And it becomes an example of national celebration that Muslims are the most generous. Right. But if you can't talk about Islam in the public sphere, you couldn't even say that French Muslims are quite generous during Ramadan as well. So it's about unpicking the whole conversation and then doing it at the very micro level. But also, crucially, you've got to make sure that your police are trained. You've got to make sure that your recruitment, retention and appraisal policies in every public body track discrimination so that nobody's being excluded at the front door of a job. You need to make sure that the education and awareness in schools is strong. And you need to make sure that in the media, all faiths and none are fully respected, not held up to ridicule. Because if I held all sorts of some groups up to ridicule and then didn't expect a pushback, I'd just be stupid. And
yes.
if there were, and it seems to me that that's what's going down and needs to be broken open. It's hard work. It needs government resource, and all this money that's about to be invested in security laws, shutting down mosques, creating national registers of imam. It's been tried before at great expense in several places. It's had the reverse effect. That money spent on interfaith dialogue, proper training of recruitment and HR, anti-racism programs in schools would unlock so much more in the rich and glorious country that France knows itself in its heart to be.
And will be a much more positive step forward. Thank you very much for that insight, Professor Davies. Thank you for joining us today on A News.